Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. I'm Ian Golden, the director, for those that don't know me. And it's a huge pleasure this afternoon to be able to introduce Doyne Farmer. Doyne is the director of the Complexity Economics Group within the Institute for New Economic Thinking at the Oxford Martin School. And he is also still a visiting professor at the Santa Fe Institute, and he's a professor in the mathematics department, Mathematical Institute at Oxford. And we are really delighted that he came to Oxford to start this group in the Institute for New Economic Thinking because he is the world leader in this field. And so we really have been proud and delighted to have him here. And since he's been here, he's been at the forefront of many activities at Oxford and beyond, including with the Bank of England and with other groups, which really show the value of original thinking in the ways that he will describe to you. He's got a long career in this area. He cut his teeth as a physicist, was one of the first developers of wearable digital devices, and over a drink he might tell you about what the casinos of the US thought about that idea, because he was very quickly able to, with others, use it to beat roulette and other tables. But he really was a pioneer in what now is rather commonplace. He was also one of the pioneers of chaos theory, which subsequently, of course, became well known. He ran the Complex Systems Group, founded it at Los Alamos Laboratories in the US. So he's got a very long tradition, starting before many of you were born in this area, but continues to be incredibly inventive, and we will benefit from that in economics, in other areas, both conceptually and in terms of the very practical implications, which Doyne, no doubt, will tell us about as well. So delighted you're all here, and particularly delighted to welcome Doyne to the podium.
Well, thanks to everybody for coming today. I'm going to talk about my favorite subject, which is technology. But I'm going to talk about technology from the sort of big picture view of how does technology come into being, how does technology change, how does that interact with, how does that evolve through time. And I want to start by just pointing out that technology's been around a long time. Here's a picture, a Stone Age picture of a guy skiing. I like his little hat, and his little poles there. His skis are pretty long. It's interesting to see how that's changed through time. And you know, technology has been with us for a long time. In fact, I would argue it's played an essential role in shaping who we are. These, I'm showing you pictures here of tools that were found 3.3 million years ago. And these little artist renderings are just to give you an idea of what the creatures that were using these tools, our ancestors way back there, were like. You can see they're quite different from us. And I would argue, as I think others do, that it's not that we got smart and suddenly we're able to use all these tools. We started to use very primitive tools that affected the way our brain evolved because it affected selection. And then we made better tools, and there was a self-reinforcing process. So in a sense, I think tools define what is human. Of course, I know that, you know, crows use tools and other animals use tools in a very selective way, but we use them in a much more dramatic way. This is just a statement to say that if you start looking carefully at what it takes to survive, if you really take a person without a tool at all, we'd have a very hard time surviving in most environments. And in fact, if you also think about population, the huge population of the Earth, the super exponential growth in population that we've experienced over the last 2,000 years has really been a coevolution between technology improving, allowing us to increase the carrying capacity of human beings on the planet, and in turn having more inventors who then created more and better tools, and that self-reproducing process has driven that remarkable evolution. Now, I also want to, I would argue that technology is sort of the neglected part of the noosphere. Now, what do I mean by that? Teilhard de Chardin coined this term because he envisioned biological evolution and culture and technology all evolving together, and talked about the rich ways in which those things interact and depend on each other for people. And I think that the technology is the part of that in a way we devote the least attention to understanding in a broad sense. If you look at what people do when they study technology, well, most of the understanding is still anecdotal. We have economic historians and some growth economists, okay, so what do the economic historians do? They take specific examples and they tell stories about their history and how they came to be the way they are. And those stories are great. I've put a few of my favorite storytellers in this style on this slide. And then on the other side, you have growth economists, Paul Romer being a famous example of such a style. And well, I'll come back and say in a minute something about what they do. Now, I would argue that our understanding of technology is pre-Linnaean. And I would just want to remind everybody, in case there are people who don't know this, I was surprised to discover a few of my economics colleagues hadn't even heard of the guy. But he's the person who first created a taxonomy for organisms, you know, the big, not bacteria, but essentially everything that isn't really small. And though he did this before evolution, before there was an idea of how it all came about, and that taxonomy has evolved since Linnaeus first did it, but it's remarkably similar to, I would argue, to the one we have now, and it was a foundation that Darwin used to create the theory of evolution. Without that foundation, I don't think Darwin would have been able to make enough sense out of the world to go anywhere. And we don't have that kind of foundation in a solid way for technology. Now, it is true that the patent offices and some of the economic statistical agencies do create a classification system for inventions and for industries, but when you start looking at these carefully, they're done in a very ad hoc way and mixing different criteria together in ways. There has been no systematic effort to create a proper taxonomy for technology. I don't want to spend too much time on this here, but I think it's a fascinating topic to think about, the analogies between biological evolution and technological evolution. On this slide, I list some of the similarities. I list some of the differences. You can skim this quickly if you're interested in this, or we can come back and talk about it after the lecture. I don't want to give you the idea that the two things are the same, but they both satisfy the essential characteristics of evolution that Darwin named, namely descent with variation and selection. The details of how the descent happens and how the variation happens and how the selection happens change, but those three fundamental properties of evolution are the same in both cases. And while in biology, we've explored to a considerable extent in some detail how these different factors influence the way biological organisms evolve through time, we have not really done that properly yet in technology. And I'm citing there a review paper of me and some others that you can look at if you're interested in. Now, just to mention a few key differences, one is that technological evolution does happen very differently. It's more analogous to what in biology is called horizontal gene transfer. If you look at bacteria don't have traditional sex. They have this sort of funny sex where they can interact with each other and sort of grab pieces of their genome and splice them together. And so you get these funny horizontal transfers, and you can't organize taxonomy of bacteria into a tree as you can with organisms that reproduce sexually. And that's more like what happens in technology. If you start reading the accounts of the people I mentioned, you'll see that inventors grab a little bit of this from over there and a little bit of that from over there. You do see remarkable similarities in things like form through time. If you look at something like early light bulbs, they looked surprisingly like gas lights, even though there's no good technological reason for them to do so, simply because that's what they were robbing. But it's a much harder, I'm saying this just to emphasize that it's actually much harder to create a taxonomy for technologies. It's been very hard for biologists to create proper taxonomies for bacteria. There's also some essential differences in terms of the data available, and the data you can get your hands on always drives what you're able to do as a scientist. In biology, for what I would argue are essentially historical reasons and the fact that sexual reproduction is simpler, we have a detailed knowledge of phylogeny. People have been thinking about that carefully for 250 years, since the time of Linnaeus. But we have no real knowledge about performance. It's almost a silly question to ask, well, how good were dinosaurs at the things they did? You know, and one is left not knowing. I mean, were dinosaurs significantly, how smart were they? How fast were they? How efficient were they? We don't know that kind of thing. We, in general, don't even have good information about that for modern organisms. In technology, on the other hand, we don't have a good taxonomy. We, at most, have an anecdotal phylogeny. Phylogeny means how does one technology or how does one thing turn into the things that succeed it. But we do, in many cases, have a good knowledge of performance, and I'm going to build on that, on what I'm going to tell you about today. Now, back to economics, traditional growth economics focuses on production functions of aggregate economies. So to a traditional growth economist, they start with something like the Cobb-Douglas production function. So you've got Y, which is the amount of stuff produced, times A, which is the total factor of productivity. That's sort of how good is that factory at producing that thing, times the capital raised to some power, times labor raised to 1 minus that power, just to take the most vanilla version of a production function one could do. And so they prove a lot of things. They derive models using this. And technology is, note, reduced to a number that typically describes, oftentimes describes an entire economy of a whole country. So technology is just this number. And if you look at growth economics, people like Paul Romer go beyond it by postulating that number changes in time in some way, and they write down dynamical equations for how technology, that number, changes through time. But technology is a much richer thing than that. And I'm going to go into some detail in the second part of my talk on how one can get underneath that and think about the ecological properties of technology and get a richer theory. So for my talk today, I want to go from these kind of generalities that I'm speaking in now down to a couple of specific examples that illustrate the kind of things that one can do. And I want to begin, actually, with a slide that illustrates the policy implications and the importance of thinking about this problem and understanding it better. So in the slide that I'm showing you here, I'm comparing the costs of 3 different technologies associated with generating electricity through time. So the first technology you might want to look at, I guess I don't know whether this doesn't work or it's too complicated to figure it out. But so if you look at this black curve here, this is the coal fuel price for electricity generation over about the last 150 years. And I've put it in units of how much coal contributes to generating electricity in a modern plant. Thank you, Clara. You're going to show me how to use this thing that I should have looked at before I got up here. Oh, it's this little red one there, maybe? No. Okay. All right.
The red one.
Great. Thanks. Okay. So this is the price of coal as a function of time. And I wanted you to notice that, okay, it's adjusted for inflation, that while it wiggles up and down, it has not changed very much in 150 years. Second example is nuclear power. So here we plot a little red triangle for every nuclear power plant that came online in the United States, and we plot the cost of electricity on this axis over here from the nuclear power plant when that plant came online. And what you can see is during the 20 or 30 years that the US was building nuclear power plants, costs, first of all, didn't change very much. And if anything, there's a trend that they went up. Maybe that's because of safety concerns getting heightened during that period. There's also a selection effect because, like the last one to come online, I think took 22 years between the time the project started and when it finally delivered, and it was probably one of the worst projects. Now, in contrast, this green curve here is the cost of solar energy photovoltaic modules as a function of time, plotted in somewhat different units, so it's dollars per watt peak. So what does that mean? How much does it cost to build a module that will generate a watt of electricity in full sunlight if it's just, so what does that cost? And what you can see is this has come down dramatically. In fact, if you go back to the 1956, circa 1956, when nuclear power and solar photovoltaics both came into being as technologies that were, the first use of solar was in the Vanguard satellite, and the first nuclear power plant appeared around then. Solar PVs dropped by a factor of 2,500 in the same period that nuclear has remained flat or gone up in cost. So there's something rather dramatically different happening in these two technologies, and this is a very important thing to take into account when you start thinking about planning for the future. And just as a reference point, this little red cross here is the projected price of the Hinkley Point power plant, scheduled to come online in 2021 or something like that. And so here we have an extrapolation, and we actually intentionally tried to make it somewhat pessimistic for, because by the way, there's an arbitrarily lining up of this axis and this axis, but we positioned that in order to give you a feeling for when you take into account the other parts of solar, like the distribution costs and so on, roughly where those things would line up. It, of course, by the way, depends on whether you're in Britain or New Mexico, where I lived for a long time. New Mexico is much more favorable for solar energy than Britain, as anybody who's spent this horrible winter here can acknowledge. But nonetheless, we see that solar is projected to be at least as cheap as Hinkley Point then, and to go beyond that to be cheaper than coal before not too far after that. Okay, but so what I'm going to do in my first part of my talk is I'm going to try and respond to the skeptic. Because if you're a skeptic, you should be asking, well, I mean, you're just extrapolating trends here. How do we know that that's actually going to happen? What are the chances something else might happen? And how might we take these kind of trends into account when we plan for the future? So I just want to reiterate before going on to answer that question that different technologies improve at vastly different rates. And in this slide here, we see the improvement rate, which is a positive number measured in the % per year that the costs of the technology have historically dropped for, on one hand, things like computer hardware or DNA sequencing out here, which are the outliers. I mean, DNA sequencing has been dropping at something like 100% per year. Computer hardware is dropping around 40% per year. And just bear in mind, you know, the economy improves at around 3% per year. So there's something very dramatic going on with these kind of technologies. In contrast, most technologies are in this sort of central peak here, and you know, oil, for example, is around 0 here. Coal, I already told you, is around 0. Solar photovoltaics are improving at a rate of around 10% per year. So it's not nearly as dramatic as, say, computer hardware, but it's nonetheless, as I showed you in the other slide, still quite different. One of the central questions, open questions, is why are these all so different? That's a question we don't have a very good answer for, although I think we have some clues. Now, so how can we predict the costs of technology? You might think that technology involves innovation, and because it involves innovation, innovation almost by its very nature should be something unpredictable. Innovation is something new. So how can we predict something new? Well, when you look back through the history, I don't want to claim we can predict we can't predict exactly what the new things we're going to invent are. But we often see very clear trends in the rate at which the performance of technologies improves through time. And this actually was already noted by this fellow Theodore Paul Wright in 1936. A very interesting guy, by the way. He is the brother of Sewell Wright, who, if you're a biologist, you'll know is one of the most famous evolutionary biologists, and Percival Wright, who is one of the founders of political science. But he was the black sheep of the family. He went off to World War I, was a flying ace, came back and went to the aviation business, and in 1936 wrote his sole paper, which basically said, I have observed that when you look at a given kind of airplane, a given model, and if you plot the cost of producing that airplane, the cost of producing the airplane, here shown on logarithmic scale, as a function of the cumulative production of that airplane, then you see a straight line, meaning that the cost drops as a power law of the cumulative production of the airplane. So something's happening, we get better at producing the airplane, and the costs drop through time. And by the way, he went on to head aviation production for the United States during World War II and used his own rule to make forecasts about what planes were going to cost during the war quite successfully. Now, my guess is everybody in the room knows very well the other law that's been postulated about technological improvement, which is Moore's law, which started out as a statement about how the density of transistors would increase as a function of time. And there was a little adjustment in the rate after the first announcement, but that has held quite true through time. And what we've seen through time is that this doesn't just apply to the density of transistors, it applies to computer performance, it applies to things like memory capacity, it applies to things like hard disks that don't, actually that's quite a different technology from a transistor. And so it applies to lots of things. In fact, we're seeing it applies to more and more things, and I'll show you examples. So here, in fact, I show you example comparing 3 different technologies, transistors, photovoltaics, hard disk drives, and ethanol, and looking at the rate at which their costs have dropped as a function of time in the style of Moore's law. Now, just to compare, I now show you the same things in the style of Wright's law. So the difference is that for Moore's law, we're plotting the logarithm of the cost as a function of time, and for Wright's law, we're plotting the logarithm of a cost as a function of cumulative production. Note for transistors, which is like this series here, cumulative production has actually changed by 9 or 10 orders of magnitude during the time span. By the way, the data that we're plotting actually Gordon Moore himself gave to us. So you can see that these differences are, well, from this you can see actually, interestingly, both of these laws work pretty well. So how can that be? Well, it turns out that if you plot something else about those, if you plot the production as a function of time, you see that production also increases more or less exponentially as a function of time. And in fact, you can show that if, and this was shown by this fellow SAHAL in 1987, a very simple mathematical exercise, if you take something that's dropping in cost at some, or sorry, increasing in cost like production at some rate A exponentially, and something like cost that's dropping in cost exponentially as a function of time, and you just eliminate time from these equations, you get the production should drop as a power in cumulative, cost should drop as a cumulative, as a power of cumulative production at some exponent that's closely related to these. And so we tested this with my colleague Bela Nagy, and you can see that both of these work quite well. So when you have these 2 facets working together, there's actually not much difference between Wright's law and Moore's law. Now, I can't resist telling you a bit of a strange anecdote, which is when we noticed this, Bela discovered that SAHAL had vanished in about 1989. And he actually tracked down his brother in India and had a long correspondence and asked people what happened. And then Bela himself vanished in about 2013. So it's a rather strange story. So I don't know what happened to Bela. which is too bad. Bela, if you're out there, I miss you. Anyway. Now, back to the main part of this story. Is technology predictable? Yes, but people have been using this to make predictions for a while, but personally, I don't like forecasts unless I have error bars in those forecasts. If you make a point prediction for something that's quite noisy, that point prediction can actually be almost worse than having no prediction at all. And so we've been struggling with how to do that for some time. There was a first paper that I just cited from Bela and others. Francois Lafond, who's sitting right there in the audience, and I have a new paper out where we've come up with quite a nice way to make these forecasts and have error bars so that we can really say not only what the forecast is, but how good the forecast is. And so we developed this method and we've tested it on time series for about 50 different technologies, and through some mathematical tricks that I'll allude to, but you don't necessarily need to understand, we managed to use the experience with all the different technologies in our database to make better forecasts for any specific technology. Now, how did we test all this? How did we gain experience? Well, we gathered time series on the costs of technologies through time. We then would pretend to be at some past point in time, say 1980, and we would make forecasts for 1981, 1982, 1983, pretending that we only had information available in 1980. And then we tried various methods, and we scored everything based on their forecasting errors. And in order to do a good job with something like this, because these series are very short, the statistics are very poor, you have to somehow pool the data from all these 50 different technologies together. And the way we did that is to make a very bold hypothesis. It's very simple. And so I will show that in this first slide, this first equation here. We rewrote Moore's law as what is also called a random walk with drift. It's actually a geometric random walk in the sense that we look at y, which is now the logarithm of the cost, and we look at how much that changes in any given year, and we say, well, there's going to be some drift term, that's the trend for how fast that comes down, plus some noise term, so there's some parameter k that says how noisy is it? How much is the data going to scatter around that trend? And we can also rewrite, by the way, Wright's law this way, but I'm not going to worry about taking you through that right now. And we did this, and we make forecasts by just extrapolating the trend, like I showed you in that original slide involving solar photovoltaics. And then we do some math to use the law of large numbers to renormalize the distribution. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we can actually forecast how good our predictions will be as a function of how far in the future we try to predict. That's this quantity tau. And how many data points we have to make the prediction with. That's this quantity m. And so we can make some kind of normalized error, normalizing for how noisy it happens to be, that we can actually say a priori, this is how accurate we think our forecast should be. So we did this with a very simple random walk with drift and found that we got things qualitatively right, but we were consistently forecasting the errors too low. So then we said, well, wait a minute, let's look at the data more carefully. There's a lot of correlation in these errors. If we make a good forecast one year, we tend to make a good forecast next year. If we make a bad forecast, we tend to make another bad forecast. And so we went back and generalized the model, and we get a formula that still looks kind of like this. And by the way, let me just mention, this formula makes very good intuitive sense. There's two terms here. The first one says that the squared error is proportional to the time. Now, this is the innate error of the stuff that we can't control. Even if we had an infinite amount of data and knew the exact parameters, the thing's inherently noisy, and noise just diffuses at some rate tau. Then the second term has to do with the errors we're making in the parameters. So when we get more data, this error gets smaller, but asymptotically, in the long time limit, the errors you make from estimating are always the ones that dominate. So it makes a rather precise prediction about how the errors should grow with time. So we took all our data and we made about 6,000 forecasts, and we tested it, and sure enough, we're able to fit the errors that we actually observe from all that data, as a function of the time horizon here, we see that the normalized error for making the forecast is growing in the way that we would predict. And we can even show that it collapses under the distribution that we would predict. So it's all kind of nice stuff, but useful, because now, well, we can go make a forecast for a specific technology like solar photovoltaics. And so here we see the data for solar photovoltaics, the historical data, or the dates down there. And we're sitting here at, I believe, 2013. And then we make forecasts going forward. And we are now making probabilistic forecasts. So this is the 1 standard deviation fluctuation. The whole thing is a 2 standard deviation fluctuation. And you can see we can assign probabilities to the future costs of solar photovoltaic modules. And this has been confirmed by all the testing that we did on all the other technologies using this same method, not just testing, well, testing to see how good the errors we would make using this forecasting technique. And so now, let me just anecdotally mention that there's been a lot of discussion in the last few years saying, well, we really need nuclear power because we just can't ramp solar energy up fast enough. You know, solar energy at this point provides less than 1% of the world's energy. How in the world are we going to provide a significant fraction in time to deal with global warming? Well, let me just say that if you actually just take the data here, and we show the data here for what fraction of the world's primary energy is provided by solar photovoltaics, and you just extrapolate this curve, what you see is it hits the 20% point, which is around where you expect it might be able to go without dealing with harder problems with storage in 2027. That's shortly after the Hinkley Point plant is scheduled to be developed. So those are, at least this kind of analysis suggests that those arguments are a bit weak. Now you should be a little skeptical of this because if you look at nuclear power, this red curve here, you can see it came shooting up and then it flattened out. So again, we don't guarantee these things exist, and we haven't actually applied our method to this kind of data. This data is a little bit different because now there's an inherent ceiling. That is, nothing's going to provide more than the full energy supply, and that's not going to grow exponentially or at the rate that something like solar has been growing. So now, let me just say that we can do something similar for Wright's law. There's an important policy implication because if you support a technology by doing R&D or even just by producing it, what Wright's law says is that producing that technology causes the price to drop. So we have to make some choices about which technologies we're going to pursue. We want to pursue the ones that are most likely to deliver benefits, and we've been working hard to actually give advice about the optimal portfolio for technologies. And it's really important to understand the properties of each of the technologies in the portfolio so that you understand the return that you will make on your investments in terms of how fast they will improve. And unfortunately, this has largely been lacking from the policy debate so far. Let me just mention that Wright's law actually tends to do a little better than Moore's law, but the differences that we've seen so far are not dramatic. Now, I want to go on to the second part of my talk because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. And so I'm going to change the topic fairly dramatically. I'm going to give you a different example. And now I'm going to get a little bit more toward what I dangled out at the beginning of my presentation. It's a step toward an evolutionary theory of technological change that gives us a little bit more understanding about how the ecology works and how the different members of the ecology influence each other, and how that's actually useful, again, for getting an understanding of things like which country is going to grow faster than which other country, or which economy of which country is going to grow faster. I'm increasingly convinced that ecology is a key concept that happens to be something that we associate with biology, but that applies in a very universal way to many different things. Here I quote two examples in economics. One I'm about to tell you about. I also have an old paper talking about how one can think about financial ecologies for trading strategies. And many people have also thought about things like the ecology of things on the internet. and PageRank is actually, which Google has famously used, is an example of something that actually has been around in ecology for a long time. Now, the model I'm going to show you is based on a framework that's been around in economics for a long time. It's due to Vasily Leontiev, fascinating guy who, left the Soviet Union, went to went to Harvard, and in Leontief's formalism, the nodes are industries, so each industry, so you can think of it as a network. The nodes are industries, each produce a good. They're weighted directed links, which are the inputs to each industry. So if, say, you look at the laptop industry will take inputs from the spring industry, because there are little springs underneath all these keys. And the guys who make the screen will be another industry. So you'll see a whole set of inflows into that industry, and similarly outflows to all the industries that use laptops. And it turns out that you can just write down equations for this. It's very much like chemical kinetics. You get equations that are actually precisely analogous to stoichiometric equations in chemistry, except that now you can have non-integer coefficients. And you do the usual trick of making an equilibrium assumption of saying dx dt equals 0, so the rate of change of things in time is 0. And then you end up with some algebraic equations that are used in national accounting and were particularly popular in the old days of communism for the Soviet Union and the Cubans and so on, who would try and understand, well, if we want to make this industry succeed, what do we have to do in the other industries that are inputs to make the whole thing go? Now, we're actually going to use it in a very different way, but before I show you that, I want to get at the basic idea that we're going to explore, which is the hypothesis that chain economies amplify improvements multiplicatively and therefore will improve faster because they will amplify what each other does. So you can imagine we have something like an island with coconut trees, and we have one industry that picks the coconuts and another industry that prepares the coconuts and distributes them. And, and so in this world, we've got the final sector here, and so this would be a chain economy where these guys pick the coconuts and these guys distribute and sell the coconuts, and the guys who pick the coconuts feed into this second industry. In contrast, here we have an economy where we've got two competing industries. These guys do the whole thing, these guys do the whole thing, and they both pass it there. Now that's maybe not quite right, the last thing I said, the best example now that I think about it, because you should probably get in and pick apart what they're doing more carefully. But think about a flat industry where you just have two competing industries that don't have very many intermediate steps. And now, the hypothesis is that if these guys make some improvements and these guys make some improvements, then the final consumer will actually see the product of the two improvements. Because if the parts for my laptop get cheaper, and then I make an improvement to the laptop itself, I can hand to the consumer the product of both of those improvements and give them either a cheaper or a better laptop as a result. And when we have that chain structure, things will amplify. Now, so the theory we're going to make is we're going to assume a simple local process for technological improvement. We're going to look at how these improvements propagate around the ecology of technologies, or industries in this case. And we're going to predict that there's something a bit like a PageRank that should tell us something about how fast things should improve. This thing in ecology I already mentioned is called trophic depth. It's very much like PageRank. It measures essentially how deep is the food chain in the economy. How many layers of production are there? So the hypothesis, when those layers of production get deeper, things should improve faster. Now, okay, so that makes us think about how do technologies improve? Well, when you look at this in detail, it's a pretty complicated thing. One possibility is input tuning. I could realize that, for instance, I don't need as much of this material. For example, I own a sailboat, happen to know my old sailboat was made in 1965. It had a hull. I mean, it had a fiberglass hull, but that hull was incredibly thick and heavy. And I know because I'm embarrassed to say I once ran into a rock doing 5 knots, and my boat stopped short, but it did no damage to the hull. Now, since then, people figured, well, we don't really need to make the hulls that tough, and they make them cheaper, they're a lot lighter, so they tune the inputs. They make boats that have less fiberglass in them. So that's one kind of improvement one can make. You could substitute inputs. You could use, fiberglass instead of wood, which was a big change that happened around in the 50s and 60s in sailboats. You could create You can create new goods. There's a network of things out there. We're constantly creating new products. You could make a computer. My boat has a computer on it. A boat in 1965 would not have had that. And there's, of course, improved social technologies for production. You can change the management style. You can change a lot of things about the technology. And as all this happens, you increase the number of combinatorial possibilities, so the palette gets larger, which means more and more inventions can be made in easier and easier ways. Now, for what I'm going to do now, we're going to just focus on one of these, because that's already hard enough. We're just going to pick on input tuning. And we're going to assume that we're going to go back to the LEONTIEF framework. I show you the equations here. You don't need to understand this to follow the talk, but just to show you, there's some linear equations that LEONTIEF wrote down already, and that were used to manage economies. We're going to use it in a bit of a different way, because we're going to say, let's suppose that there is some rate at which industries improve. And each industry has some improvement rate, gamma I, and the physical technology then just improves for industry I, improves at some rate, and so this matrix of interactions of these physical technologies is going to change in time in some smooth way at some rate that's determined by these gamma sub i's. And so now we just take that hypothesis and we go back to the equations I just showed you a minute ago, and we just differentiate these equations, and we get a nice differential equation that says the rate at which prices will drop for some technology, so this is now a vector of prices, is going to be, it's going to depend on these physical flows, and we can then convert this back into the money flows, and which are more easily measured, and we get some equations. So it doesn't matter if you didn't understand what I just said. But basically, we end up with some equation that says, this is the key one here, that the growth rate of an economy is going to be equal to the GDP fraction of each industry in that economy, so this is a vector, times this matrix of normalized money flows between all the industries in the economy. So now we're getting inside the technology by thinking about how the money flows from industry to industry, each industry making that technology, times some vector of improvement rates that are associated with each industry. So, okay, we can now start testing this against empirical data and asking whether it's true. So we're going to look at some data for 40 countries with 35 industries between 1995 and 2009. And we can first of all just look at what do we back out in terms of the improvement rates for the industries when we infer that number gamma for each industry in each year in each country, and we just plot them. And what we see is that, well, there's a lot of variation. Again, notice this is a logarithmic scale here. And this is gamma, so we're talking here about gamma's 0.2 means 20% annual improvement. That would be a lot. 40% improvement would be quite a bit. You might think back to things like computers. And this is every country every year. So China, we've got 40 different countries in here. So we see this distribution is actually, if this makes sense to you, very heavy-tailed. There's a lot of variation, but we see in general, the mean is actually positive, and it's around 0.7%. So we see this wide variation, but a general trend for things to improve across that time. We can then do some more math, and we can actually derive some nice things, like we could show that there's this number, which we're going to call the trophic depth, or the generalized output multiplier, that basically tells us if we can think about a given industry or a given country, how deep is the chain of production for that industry or that country. And we can, now we're going to make an even more dramatic assumption in order that I can analyze this data in a simple way. We're going to actually make the bold, almost crazy assumption that all industries in all countries are improving at the same rate. So it's not that we think that's true. I just showed you it's not at all true. But it gives us, with a ceteris paribus assumption, that is, all else equal, we can now look at what is the effect on the depth of these production chains, on the aggregate output multiplier, on production in countries as a function of time. Well, let me, to give you a little insight, first just compare two economies. So we're now going to plot the data in a new way that this theory suggests. And so what do? On the y-axis here, we plot the trophic depth of each industry in the economy, and then we range the industries, and remember, we're stuck in this case with 35 different industries. We position these industries in a standard way based on a traditional classification scheme. So we have, for example, for China, we have agriculture here. It's, out of these industries, the one with the lowest trophic depth. We have other industries for China, like electrical and optical products up here, or transportation, rubber, chemistry. So those are the industries that are up toward the top. And you'll notice that we've taken each industry and made the size of its circle equal to the importance of that industry, the GDP share of that industry in the economy. And so you can see that this electrical industry is very important for China. And these green lines, by the way, are the input-output relationships between the industries. So we place a threshold on the size of the industry in terms of flow of money from one industry to another, and we just plot the arrows corresponding to the biggest flows, so you can kind of see which industries are connected to which others. So not surprisingly, say agriculture and the food industry are connected to each other. Now, China, you'll notice, has, well, I will tell you, quite a large trophic depth. It's the country with the greatest trophic depths. And so, for example, these top industries have trophic depths of about 5.5. In contrast, the US, you can see across the board, the trophic depths are lower. Our highest industry has a trophic depth of about 3.6. Our highest industry is actually this industry COK, which is petroleum and nuclear fuel. And in contrast, look at our agricultural industry. It has a significantly higher trophic depth than the agricultural industry in China, and in fact is one of our higher trophic depth industries. Now, I don't think this is so surprising, because agriculture in China is still catching up from a very traditional agriculture where you have the peasant out tilling his land, whereas agriculture in the US is an extremely mechanized industry. You can see that the center of mass of the US economy is down here in things like, I always forget exactly what these are, public services and, I'm sorry, I'm now forgetting, wholesale and retail. We have finance here. Let's see, I thought real estate was here somewhere. But, so yeah, there's real estate. Real estate is actually among our higher trophic level industries. So it's a very different kind of economy than China has. Now, our prediction is then we should see economies like China's growing faster. So what we do is we now here plot the trophic depths of countries on this axis, on this axis. So we have China at the top with an average trophic depth, or an average output multiplier of around 4.5, against the GDP growth averaged over the period of our data. And what you see is that you have countries like China, Slovakia, Turkey, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, that are the ones with the higher trophic depths and the higher growth rates, and countries like the US and Great Britain, Japan, that are down here with lower trophic depths and lower growth rates. And okay, this is not a fantastic correlation by the standards of many fields, but it's extremely statistically significant. And when you start comparing it with what happens in standard growth models, which form the state of the art of this field, you see that actually trophic depth does better than any standard factor in a standard growth model. And that when we include it in regressions, where we include all these factors from standard growth models, it explains more about the data. It always boosts the forecast, and it's always the most statistically significant factor in the regression. So this seems to predict something significant about the economy. So I'm going to wrap up now by just saying that this is just a plot of trophic depth versus GDP. You see the countries these countries with high GDP and high trophic depth in here. You've got the countries like China and Slovakia and so on out here. And then you've got other countries that behave in some different way, Indonesia and Russia and countries like that have both low trophic depth and low GDP growth down there. This is just a time series of trophic depths of countries through time to give you a feeling for how fast this changes. And then Charles Savoy, who is my graduate student here, has done various tricks to try and back out how these trophic depths have changed through time. For the US, I have to say that as we go further backwards in time, somewhere about 1950, this starts to get more and more fanciful. But his estimate is nonetheless, that is, if you think about the trajectory of the US through this space as a function of time, we started with some lower trophic depth in the early days. As we built up our manufacturing economy, the trophic depth increased. We peaked around 1900, and then we've been slowly sliding down since then and transitioning the way the economy works to much more of a service economy, but nonetheless maintaining our high GDP. So I want to wrap up by saying that, first of all, I think this is an example of how, to explain economic growth, we need to understand technologies and their networked interactions with each other. I've tried to demonstrate that technological progress can be significantly predictable. I think there's a great challenge to get a more fundamental understanding of the factors driving those things. And in the last part, I showed you growth as an evolutionary process. Now, let me just remind you in what sense. We assumed that there's just some rate at which people improve by tinkering or whatever, and what we can see is now we explore, under the assumption that there is that sort of evolutionary improvement, we showed how the network properties of the economy can actually amplify those improvements. And I want to end by just noting that the technological ecology is extremely autopoietic. What do I mean by that? Autopoiesis was a term that was coined by Francis Varela and his colleague Maturana, and it just says that something's autopoietic if it regenerates and maintains itself. So like life is a classic example. Technology's very strongly that way. To think about that, just imagine what would happen if all technology disappeared. Suddenly we didn't have any tools. Even imagine, let's say we had some, set of monks who, were picked because they spanned the technological knowledge that we have, and they had enough freeze-dried food to exist for 100 years. And you said, okay, your job is to recreate the economy as it was when all this stuff vanished. Just start thinking about the things they would have to do, starting from scratch, in order to make that happen. I think it would be quite hard to do it in 100 years. Let me just end by saying that my conjecture is there exists an evolutionary theory for technological change. I've hopefully given you a few little appetizers for what such a theory might be that could provide us with key insights about the nature of technological innovation, help us understand how technology is occupying more and more of the noosphere that I agree with Teilhard Chardin that we need to think more carefully about. And this theory, I think one of the reasons this theory isn't happening is that it really needs to cut across many different disciplines, including economics, biology, engineering, and physics. And this, would be one of my life dreams to make this happen. So on that note, I want to end and ask you for questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Doyne, for that fascinating lecture. This is the last in our series on technology and society, and a very apt one to wrap it up and give us such a big stimulating series of conjectures and ideas around and a lot of data. So we have about half an hour for questions, answers. Who would like to go first? This is being filmed and webcast, so if you don't want to be filmed and webcast, don't put your hand up. You silenced them.
Amazing. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. So I think in macroeconomics, there's this trend going towards more microeconomics, like behavioral economics, to understand and make better predictions in macroeconomics. And your theory or parts of it seem more like predicting macro trends. Is there a way to base it on agents or on individual behaviors?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question. I certainly think so. I would love to build an agent-based model, for example, of technological innovation. There have been some attempts at that. Penny Mealy over there, for example, in her master's thesis has built such a model. And so there's a few things floating around that illustrate that general idea. Now, I think, you mentioned behavioral economics. This is a case where, let me just say that there are strong behavioral elements here, and there's a lot to be learned from a sociological perspective. There's, for example, a rich field of people who study and who do things in business schools who look at questions like, why did Silicon Valley happen in Palo Alto? So that's very much a social question, and it has to do with social process. There are other people who look at questions like, what kind of, how do you want to organize things to bring about social change or technological innovation? How do you want to set up intellectual property laws to encourage technological innovation? So those are all great things. So there's a lot of those elements sitting around in kind of isolated pockets. The biological theory that I want to bring together would draw on those, but really think about technology as an ecology, collect data about those, and think about the process of change from the point of view of the selection that's imposed on inventors and firms and products when they compete with each other in the same way that it happens in biology, and try and get a better understanding of the features that cause that to come about. So it would incorporate elements of microeconomics, ending up with macroeconomic consequences, and drawing on lots of things that sociologists and others have been thinking about.
Hi. I'm sure you know, it's very interesting relationships in ecology between the structure of systems and their trophic depth and their resilience. I wondered if there's any connection between the evolution of the trophic depth that you showed us and the resilience of technological systems, or therefore economic systems.
Well, I think that's I think that's a great question. Now, and I would conjecture that there are such relationships. The closest thing I know, there's a student of Alan Kerman's, Martha Alatriste, who's a young Mexican economist, who did a study for France. She got the input-output network for France and asked questions about if you shock a given industry by, for example, the French government could stimulate that industry, which stimulations are more effective? People have also looked some at questions like knockouts. If you damage an industry, how much does that affect things? And one would expect that from network theory, you'd be able to see something about those kind of properties. To my knowledge, nobody has done that yet, although I could be wrong and I've just missed the paper, because that's a natural sort of thing, and that's the kind of thing network guys love to do. That's a sort of one of the standard algorithms. Network theorist, you know, how does the structure of the network influenced by this? But I'm sure that it makes a big difference.
And people do it with trade modeling.
Yeah.
By shocking on the trade, etc.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
How does the theory relate to or explain what happened to the German economy after the Second World War? Because it had explosive growth.
Yeah. So I don't, to be honest, I think the dominant factors there were probably not things that are well captured in our theory. But I want to use this as just to emphasize that with those final steps I made of you know, the all else equal part, we're throwing a whole lot of stuff out. Because there are a lot of those kind of social factors that you were referring to. I mean, clearly things about infrastructure and factors like the strength of the rule of law, the cultural climate, all these things play a role, and those are all in addition to what I was talking about here. I was just trying in this to basically, you know, one of my algorithms as a scientist is to look at the things that nobody else is looking at and move in the orthogonal direction to the herd and try and find something that people haven't quite pinned down. And so that it was in that spirit. But I think to really understand something like what you're talking about, like why did Germany take off so strongly, you really need to look at these other factors. And I think we know some of those factors, like you had a country with an extremely high skill level, an extremely high technology expertise base that was absolutely flattened and, you know, given a bit of a helping hand to pull itself out of the very deep hole it was in. And, but that's just a story that I think everybody knows. So I don't think we help much on that.
No, you do need it because it's been recorded. Yeah.
So it might be a trivial question. When you compared the flat versus the chain networks and gave the example of the coconut producers, you said it was better for the chain one because you could accumulate the improvements in the process over the two stages rather than independently. But the trouble is it might end up being, well, let me give an example because maybe I might mean both. It's an old example because I'm an old man. In the 1980s, IBM was the major developer of mainframes in the world, and their senior designer was Gene Amdahl, and he had ways of improving their technology which they didn't want to implement for various commercial reasons. So he had to actually set up his own company, which competed quite successfully for several years with IBM to improve the technology. So I guess it's a slightly monopolistic danger of the right hand, or is that a naive question?
Yeah. So it's another good question, and I think maybe it'll help clarify it. I completely agree that one needs to take competition into account. It's an essential thing to make any kind of evolutionary process sensible. What we're doing here is lumping together typically all the industries, all the companies in the same industry together. So Amdahl and IBM would be lumped into the same node, so we would be relying on that competition to be driving the progress forward. We're just saying that insofar as the industry can essentially parse out the different tasks, so different groups make the different pieces, and you have a trophic chain-like structure where things flow through, then that's a very efficient structure at amplifying the improvements that they're making as they go along. And so let me I could point back at a relation that we derived that one of the simple relations we were able to derive is just that this quantity on the left, which is just the average trophic depth of a country, the average aggregate multiplier of a country, is equal to the gross output of the country divided by the net output of the country. So in other words, the gross output is the aggregate of everything everybody makes. The net output is the stuff that's actually getting consumed. That's GDP. But if you have an economy with more gross output, then that trophic depth is deeper. So that's, in a way, a very simple way to think about what's going on. There is you have to make sure you do the accounting right to measure these things correctly. And there's some tricky bits that we discuss in our paper. But modulo that, anyway, I hope I answered your question.
I wanted to ask how the trophic depth of an industry changes by its degree of sophistication, or if there is a link that exists between the two. And if so, would we then see that perhaps some industries are limited or constrained in some way to the level of trophic density they could achieve? And would that leave us with a very dismal prediction of how fast they could grow over time?
Yeah. So this is a very good question, and I think, yes, the trophic depth is, at least in some way, a reflection of something about how sophisticated the industry is, because you don't get an industry with a lot of trophic depth unless that industry has a lot of inputs that need to be processed, and there's a lot of flow from the raw materials that are dug out of the ground into the final product that's getting produced. Now, that said, let me be a bit careful. The way it turns out, if you want to identify the trophic depth of the industry, one easy way to think about it is if that industry spends $1 to make its product, so they pay a worker or they pay for a part, how long does it take that dollar to get back to the workers, the final goods sector, and the household sector? And so if the industry pays out all of its money to workers, then its trophic depth is by definition low. So you expect a lot of service industries to have low trophic depth, period. You know, the massage industry is not going to have a high trophic depth. Okay, they've got to pay for their electricity, and you know, maybe they read a book on massage, but mostly just, you know, direct. Whereas agriculture in the US can be a high trophic depth industry because there's a lot of very sophisticated technology now being used, and that sophisticated technology in turn needs more sophisticated technology, and so the dollars that are spent on agriculture in the US are actually taking a long time to percolate back to the worker. So it's indirectly a reflection of the kind of thing you're talking about that is related to the complexity of the industry. But I have to say, we wrestled with this for a long time before sort of sharpening that point.
You suggested at the beginning that Wright's law might be relatively stable, but I'm wondering...
what might be stable?
Wright's law.
Wright's law.
Wright's law. But I'm wondering if there's there's obviously an endogenous aspect to it. So if you have a cost reduction, you gain market share in a competitive environment, and by gaining market share, you increase your volume, and then the higher cumulative volume feeds back into lower cost.
Yeah.
Now, with that kind of endogenous process, you might think that these trends could be rather unstable, which may be why you've got a random walk there rather than a linear trend. But the related question is, if there is some outside intervention, some exogenous intervention, the government, let's say, intervenes and increases the scale of the industry through a subsidy or some other kind of intervention, how can you be sure that that will have the same effect on the shape of the graph as a natural evolution through competition?
This is an excellent set of questions. So in a longer version or a different version of this talk, I address those. So two things. So really what John is asking about is the causality. In a picture like this, is it increased production that causes cost to drop? Or does decreasing cost cause production to increase? And there's clearly causality flowing, well, at least one way. That is the kind of story that John suggested. If costs drop, then the technology gets cheaper and more people can buy it. And so then the people who produce it go, okay, there's a bigger market than there was, so they make more of them. And cost drops some more, and that goes on. So there's causality flowing from cost. But there's also, it's argued, causality flowing from production. Well, one simple example, actually, let me first of all say the classic example would be learning. So the field that surrounds us is actually usually called learning by doing. And the idea is that the guys in the aircraft factory that Wright originally observed, you know, they just notice, hey, Charlie, you know, when we're making this propeller here, if we did it this way, it'd be easier to make and it'd be just as good. And so they learned something, and now it doesn't cost as much because it takes less labor to produce it. So that's one factor that's going on in there. Actually, try not to use that phrase, though, because I think there's other important factors, and in particular, there's economies of scale. If you produce more planes, you can make bigger factories, you can give more thought into automating, you can do lots of things that'll make the planes cheaper to produce. And you can just work out that if you have an economy of scale of a certain type, you get Wright's law just from that. In fact, if you have a perfect economy of scale where you have a factory that if you just build a factory and then you can make an infinite number of things for free after that, you get Wright's law with exactly an exponent of -1. The normal exponent, by the way, is about -0.3, which corresponds to every time you double production, costs drop by about 20%. So, okay, so there's other things there's other causal factors flowing from production to cost. Now, we actually, with Francois and Diana Greenwald, we collected a lot of data on World War II because we said, hey, we have a great natural experiment, because we know that it wasn't that Roosevelt said, gosh, you know, tanks are getting cheap, let's build more of them. You know, they said, God damn it, we're gonna build tanks no matter what it takes. And in fact, when you look at that, the costs of wartime technologies came down. And they came down pretty significantly during the course of the couple of years, 2 or 3 years, where the US was ramping its production up from being the 17th largest military in the world to producing 2/3 of all the military goods produced by either side during the war. But that said, we did not see, we do see an effect of increased production means costs dropping more, but the bigger effect is just the overall effect that costs were dropping for all of these things, and it's not discriminating strongly between the ones that were hugely ramped up and the ones that were just significantly ramped up. So the evidence is still murky on this point, to answer your question, John. And I think that actually one of the challenges we're working on is trying to find a better theory that parses out these causal links, trying to find ways of getting the data to tell us about this, because I think it's a key question to answer for policy. Because if it's true that there's a big effect from cumulative production to cost, then things like feed-in tariffs that directly try and stimulate production should be really effective. And if the causality is dominantly the other way, then they should not be very effective. So it's an open question, though I'd say the data at least hints that these things are effective. But, yeah.
There. Did you stand your hand up in the back? Yeah, in the back there.
I have a question about industry structure. Industries compete with each other over time because they're competing for consumers' resources. And does your theory enable you to predict the way in which the structure of a country's industry will change? You showed us the difference between China's structure and the US structure. Is it inevitable that China will adopt a US structure over time, and do you have a way of forecasting that?
We, and in particular, Charles Savoy and Penny Mealy has been working on this a little bit now, and so we're very much trying to answer your question right now. We do believe there are strong patterns in the way that happens. We're somewhat inspired by work of Ricardo Hausmann's group and Luciano Pietronero's group, who have pointed out that if you look at export data and you look at the paths that countries go through the export space, that those paths are not random, that there's this a notion of the adjacent possible, a phrase that was coined by Stuart Kaufman, whereas there's a set of things that you can get to in one step. And you've got to go through that step before you can take the next step, and that constrains the way you can move through these spaces. So we very much think that's at work here, and that we can characterize it, and we can actually forecast, and Charles has already had some success, this is going into his PhD thesis, the way, the forecasting exactly that.
you've mentioned that if we had to reboot the technology for nothing, it would have taken a very long time. Because somehow technology always builds on, there's an industry, there's an industry on top of it, and they feed into each other. And I've heard very similar theories in Baker's Wright's the law of accelerating returns. I mean, it's a very controversial figure. But
Wait, what was the name of the person you said?
Ray
Ray Kurzweil, okay. Yeah,
now is known for being chief engineer in Google.
yeah.
So what he argues there is, first of all, it's relevant because it's a generalization of Moore's law, but also that, but he argues, what he argues next from here, as far as I understand, it's not formalized in any way, while your work is a lot more precise, is that the exponential acceleration happens because the more technology improves, that fits into itself because it's a positive feedback loop in a certain way. So I expect a formula expressing this would have some sort of recursive structure. So I'm just wondering if you've looked into that and if you have anything in that direction.
Well, I think that, I agree Ray Kurzweil's controversial. Increasing returns is something that's not very well understood in economics. And you do get, the problem is when you start, things become unstable. And so you have to understand the stabilizing factors that are going to keep things from becoming unstable, and somehow that's not properly part of the story yet. Another interesting open question. But you have to be a little careful because it's easy to write down an equation that says the faster this thing improves, the more it's going to improve in the future. But then you need a story for, well, why would you expect that to be true? And that kind of story is hard to come by. This relates a little bit to John's question about Wright's law. And let me just say that, I should say we have, I think, the best theory for why Wright's law is true. Our theory just has to do with engineers throwing darts and showing that if, we assume the engineers throw darts and they are at least smart enough to see when they've made a good throw. And if the industry is more structured in that, in order to make an improvement, you say something like an automobile, if the guys in the carburation division say, we figured out how to make a fuel injector that will make everything work better, well, they immediately have to talk to the guys in the ignition system and other groups, and so they've all got to come together and make their improvements. So we have a theory along those lines, and we can actually derive Wright's law and make a few predictions about it. But somehow that's missing the kind of thing that John was also alluding to, that there's a feedback going on, and I think that's an essential part of the story that we're not capturing very well. And I think trying to get a more fundamental understanding of what is it in economics that drives Wright's law, where does that come from, is an open question. And by the way, I might tell a story. I got interested in this because this would have been in the early 2000s. I was talking to Ken Arrow, one of the most famous economists in the world. And I said, Ken, this was at the Santa Fe Institute, tell me what is a really good empirical, something that has really good empirical support behind it in economics. And he said, well, there's this thing, learning by doing. And happens he wrote one of the seminal papers on it. So it's an odd thing that it's one of the best empirical regularities in economics, yet not understood, really. So.
Nick, do you have a question?
I have a microphone. So I'd like to go right back to the beginning, because you had me from slide 1, and your philosophy of technological change. I think it's, well, I guess, yeah, this one. And so maybe if you could just give you an opportunity to talk a bit more about your underlying philosophy for technological evolution and where Desjardins came in that whole evolution of technology and complexity is going somewhere.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is that part of your thinking about all of this?
The omega point is not a part of my thinking. So this is a great question, and I'm going to have a little fun with this one.
I'm a political scientist, so the economics doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. So, you know, Desjardins is a pretty amazing guy. I mean, he was a Jesuit priest, and yet who thought very widely about all these things and was also a physical anthropologist. In fact, some people believe he was the joker behind the Piltdown Man scandal, if you happen to know about that. They played a trick on the Brits. They kind of said, hey, because everybody was concerned that the good fossils were in China, and yet, you know, Britain, we must have these great, something must have happened here too. So he hid some animal bones and tricked anyway, sorry, I'm digressing. But he wasn't able to publish his work during his lifetime. And so it's an interesting mixture of science and mysticism. So the mystical part is things like the omega point, which is a very teleological explanation. Somehow God is moving us toward this omega point where we're incredibly smart and we have this amazing technology and we sort of merge with biology and technology and culture all merge together into some beautiful thing. So I don't buy the teleological part. I don't think there's some omega point that God's nursing us towards. What I do think is that the laws of physics give rise to reproductive selection, which happened first in biology, and biological organisms are, by the way, little machines. So these little machines all evolved to compete with each other. And then, you know, Australopithecus et al. Start to make tools, and we start to see culture emerging, and we start to see technology emerging, and those start to be a very important part of the story, again, with very strong competitive selection. But there is some implicit law, and now I'm going to wax philosophical, that things move towards higher complexity, towards higher information processing, toward richer structure, towards something with, you know, more and more interacting components. And I think the biggest challenge for, I mean, if you know, if I went to Faust, if I were Faust and I was going to Mephistopheles and I could answer one question, that would be the question I would like to answer. And why would I like to answer that? Because I think this question ultimately tells us a lot about the purpose of life, the meaning of life, those metaphysical questions we wrestle with in high school and then, you know, either become philosophers or give up on when we, you know, by the time we finished university. And I think complex system does give us a little hint about this because, and you see it, by the way, when you read biology papers. Biologists are very careful to say, well, we don't believe in teleology. Yet when you read a molecular biology paper, they will say, well, this thing is a rotor and it performs the following function. They give you descriptions that involve the purpose of that device within the biological system. And so I think part of this evolutionary theory would inform us about purposes. And I think, well, these things aren't going to just say, Doyne, this is the meaning of life. They do give us little hints about what that is. And the process that we're participating in to drive us towards this increasing richness of the universe that I think we're much more tricked in, where the cultural incentives that we get are much more about initiating our role in that than they are about making us happy or something. Because we're all playing our little bits in this pageant of doing that. So thank you for that question.
All right, we got the final question and then wrap up.
I was just quickly wondering, with the increasing globalization and a lot of developing nations developing sort of similar goods and services, how much sort of uncertainty does that throw in the models when you can't predict sort of growth on a kind of national level?
So I missed a little bit of the first part. When we're thinking about the global economy and what?
I said with increased globalization and developing nations developing similar technologies and goods and services, how much of an uncertainty does that throw in the predicting growth on a kind of national model?
Yeah, so the national model is eroding with time. We don't or I believe, let me say, I believe that is true. If we were able to look back 100 years when economies were more isolated than they were now, I think actually some of our predictions would work better than they do now. But in fact, we can see the interactions that to really understand the trophic depth, you have to also think about trade. And so, for example, you can improve your trophic depth just by buying products from a country with high, or products with a high trophic depth that you're importing. So that seems a little bit paradoxical maybe, but just think about what happens to your dollar. Your dollar, when you buy that, now takes longer to get back. And so we're in fact, we've sort of figured out how to generalize this to deal with the fact that we don't have cleanly separated structure into different perfectly isolated economies. And I do think that if we were able to see the data through time, we would say that these distinctions are being blurred at the national level because we're increasingly heading towards one big economy. And in fact, let me just say, when we analyze the data, we actually take all countries and all industries in the data set, and we do construct one big economy, and we can think about the trophic depth of the whole economy, and it's around a little under 3.
Great. Doyne, that was a magnificent display of interdisciplinary thinking, very much in the spirit of the Oxford Martin School, which is all about the future and how we understand it. And obviously, this intersection of technological, economic, and other trends is at the heart of that. So thank you for that. This is also the last in our seminar series this term. You will have a break until next term, starting on the 28th of April, when the seminar series will commence on our new research theme, which is the tension between collective and individual incentives. It's called Our Shared World, Individual and Collective Outcomes. And it's really about how we are going to deal with issues like climate change, oceans, antibiotic resistance, energy systems, and many, many other things. So it's going to reflect the latest work coming out of the Oxford Martin School, starting on the 28th of April, same day of the week, same time. So thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks, Doyne, for a magnificent talk, highly, highly stimulating, and some very stimulating questions as well. So thanks to you all. Good evening.